The invitation had arrived by courier 3 months earlier, cream cardstock too thick to bend. HP and Nora Callahan had known before she'd finished reading it that the seating chart would place her somewhere she wasn't meant to be seen. She'd been right. Table 9, tucked behind a pillar near the service hallway, her place card reading Nora, sister of the bride, in a font small enough that she'd had to lean close to confirm her own name was actually printed on it at all. The Ashgrove Estates ballroom stretched out beyond her in tiers of white orchids and hanging crystal, 312 guests moving through it in clusters that all seemed to know exactly where they belonged, which was more than Nora could say for herself in any room that contained her sister. She'd spent the morning at her tailoring shop finishing an alterations rush before driving 2 hours to get here, sewing pins still faintly visible along the cuff of her sleeve when she checked her reflection in the powder room mirror. The dress was hers, deep burgundy, cut to fit a body the bridal shop sample sizes had never once accommodated, because the bridesmaid gowns Vivian had chosen for the wedding party came in exactly one silhouette, and Nora hadn't been included in that particular fitting to begin with. Nobody had called to explain the omission. Nobody needed to. She'd learned over 11 years of watching her half-sister's life unfold in magazine spreads and family group chats, exactly which invitations meant witness and which meant participant. This one had always meant witness. Growing up, the distinction had cut deeper than it should have for a grown woman standing in a hallway smoothing down a dress no one had asked her to buy. Their father's second marriage had produced Vivian 3 years after Nora's mother left, and the family photographs from every holiday since had arranged themselves the same way. Vivian centered, luminous, effortless, and Nora positioned at the edge where cropping wouldn't cost anyone the better shot. Nobody had ever said the word unwanted out loud. Nobody needed to. The seating chart said it for them year after year in careful, deniable calligraphy. Nora. There you are. Their stepmother, Celeste, materialized with a champagne flute already half finished, her smile calibrated for maximum warmth and minimum eye contact. You made it. Traffic wasn't terrible, I hope? 2 hours, but fine. Nora accepted the brief, obligatory embrace, feeling the familiar current of being handled rather than greeted. The estate is beautiful. Vivian worked so hard on every detail. Celeste's gaze had already drifted past her, scanning the crowd for someone more useful to the conversation. Go find your table, sweetheart, the processional's starting soon. Nora found table 9 and sat, alone for a stretch long enough to count the pillar's carved details twice, before a woman about her own age settled into the seat beside her, offering a small, conspiratorial smile that felt like the first genuinely warm gesture of the day. You must be Nora. The woman extended a hand, rings catching the chandelier light. Priya. I do the estate's event photography. I've been shooting the prep all week, and half the staff kept mentioning the sister, like you were a rumor instead of a person. You're much more interesting than the rumor. Nora laughed despite herself, something loosening slightly in her chest. I get that a lot. The rumor usually wins. The rumor's boring. You alter clothes for a living, don't you? I saw the tag inside your dress when the wind caught it earlier. Hand-finished seams. Nobody does that anymore. Priya's genuine interest, unpolished and unhurried, was rare enough at family events that Nora found herself relaxing into it, grateful for one small pocket of the evening that didn't require bracing. The ceremony pulled everyone's attention toward the aisle soon after, and Nora watched her sister walk toward a groom whose family had made shipping fortunes look effortless for 3 generations. Watched 300 guests rise in unison for a woman who had never once, in Nora's memory, had to fight for a room's attention. The old ache arrived on schedule, familiar enough now that Nora had stopped expecting it to fade with age, though Priya's quiet company beside her softened its edges more than she'd expected anything to that day. The reception moved into its second hour before Vivian found her, flushed with champagne and the particular electricity of being the center of every conversation in the building. Nora. I almost didn't recognize you tucked back there. The laugh that followed carried just enough edge to land as unkind, pitched loud enough for the cluster of guests nearby to catch it. You're a little out of breath. Did you run from the parking structure? I swear, every year you show up looking like the whole event nearly got away from you. Nora felt her face warm, the old instinct rising to apologize for existing at the wrong angle again. I got here on time, Viv. I'm teasing. Vivian's smile widened, performing generosity for the small crowd that had gathered, sensing entertainment the way crowds always seem to. Come here for luck. Kneel down and kiss the shoe like we used to when we were kids. Remember? You always wanted to play the game so badly. The memory arrived whole and unwelcome. 7 years old, desperate for inclusion, kneeling on a different floor for a different version of this same request, believing at the time it was affection instead of the small, early architecture of a lifetime pattern. Nora looked around the circle of faces now watching, waiting, the uneasy laughter already starting at the edges of the group, and understood with total clarity that refusing here, in front of this many witnesses, would become its own headline for the evening. The sister who couldn't take a joke, who made a scene at Vivian's wedding. Beside her, she felt Priya go very still, her camera lowered, watching without lifting it, waiting to see what Nora would choose. She knelt. The marble was cold through the fabric of her dress, and for the half-second her lips touched white satin. Something in her chest went entirely, permanently still. Not the old ache this time, something colder and quieter, a door closing somewhere she hadn't realized was still open. She was rising, unsteady, when a hand appeared in front of her, palm open, uninvited and entirely unhurried. He hadn't announced himself the way people usually announce themselves in rooms like this. No throat clearing, no scanning for whether the moment belonged to him to interrupt. He'd simply crossed the marble floor while the ballroom's laughter was still finding its footing, and reached her before she'd fully found her balance. "Take my hand." Not a question. His voice carried low enough that it didn't ask the room's permission, though the entire circle heard it anyway. "You don't need to finish that." Nora took it because the alternative, refusing help twice in 1 minute in front of everyone, felt more exposing than accepting it. He steadied her with a grip that released the instant she was upright. No lingering, no theater of chivalry for the small crowd still watching. "Marcus." Vivian's champagne-bright voice had thinned considerably, the performance cracking at its edges. "You made it. I wasn't sure your flight. I landed an hour ago." He hadn't taken his attention off Nora, studying her the way a person studies something they're recalculating in real time. "I recognize you. The tailoring shop on Ferris Lane. You restructured the shoulders on a jacket of mine last spring when 3 other tailors told me it couldn't be salvaged without a full rebuild." Something in his expression shifted from observation into genuine interest. "You did it in 4 days. I never got the chance to tell you how well it held up." The recognition landed strangely in Nora's chest, unfamiliar enough that she didn't immediately trust it. Nobody at this wedding had introduced themselves to her as anything other than an appendage to Vivian's story. "That was my work, yes. I thought so." He turned then, finally, toward Vivian, and whatever warmth had colored his voice for Nora disappeared entirely. "I've spent the better part of a year deciding whether to finance your husband's shipping expansion. Capital decisions like that aren't only about numbers on a spreadsheet. They're about what kind of people I'm choosing to be associated with." He let a beat of silence stretch long enough that the nearby guest had stopped pretending not to listen. "I just watched a room full of people laugh while you made your own sister kneel on the floor for entertainment. I'll need some time to think about whether that's a family I want my name attached to." Celeste's champagne-flushed face drained of color from several tables away, the specific pallor of a woman watching her daughter's carefully staged evening collapse into something the socialite blog crew, still filming near the cake table, would absolutely be capturing. Vivian's mouth opened on some recovery that never quite assembled itself. "Marcus, it was a joke between sisters," Vivian managed finally, her voice dropping toward something almost pleading. "We used to play that game as kids." "I don't think Miss Callahan was playing." Marcus Vance said it evenly without cruelty, which somehow landed harder than anger would have. He glanced back at Nora, and this time the question in his expression was entirely genuine, waiting for her answer instead of assuming it on her behalf. "Would you walk with me? There's a terrace off the east wing." "Quieter." Nora hesitated, aware of every eye still tracking the moment, aware that leaving with him would rewrite the evening's story in a direction she hadn't chosen either. Priya caught her eye briefly, a small nod that carried no judgment either way, only permission. Nora exhaled. "All right." They walked out together, and the murmur that followed them carried a different texture than the laughter had. Something closer to recalibration, 300 people quietly reassessing a story they'd been prepared to file away as harmless family teasing. The terrace air was cool against her face, carrying the faint mineral smell of the estate's ornamental fountain below. Nora let her shoulders drop from where they'd been locked since the moment she'd read her place card, and found Marcus watching the grounds instead of her, giving her room she hadn't realized she needed until he offered it. "You didn't need to do that," she said finally. "Whatever leverage you're threatening to pull from Vivian's husband, that's not mine to accept on your terms. I don't need a rescue. I didn't do it for you specifically. I did it because I don't invest in people who think cruelty is acceptable as long as it's dressed up as tradition." He turned, studying her properly now without pity anywhere in the assessment. "Though I'll admit recognizing your work on that jacket made the decision easier. I already respected your hands before tonight. Watching that room disrespect the rest of you clarified something I hadn't fully articulated about Marcus Vance and shipping ventures I don't actually want my name attached to. You talk about yourself in the third person?" The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, the first crack in his composed exterior all evening. "Force of habit. Too many years signing documents with my own name attached to too many decisions I didn't personally make." He gestured toward the ballroom's glowing windows. "I'm not offering you anything tonight except an honest observation and an exit from a room that clearly doesn't deserve you in it. What you do with either is entirely up to you. You said you'd need time to decide about the investment." Nora studied him carefully, testing whether the statement in the ballroom had been theater or genuine calculation. Was that true, or was it just a way to end the moment quickly? It was true. His answer arrived without hesitation, which told her more than the words themselves. "I don't say things in rooms like that one for effect. I say them because I've already decided, and the saying makes the decision real to the people who need to hear it." He looked at her directly. "Your sister's husband will hear from my office by the end of the week. Formally. In writing." Nora looked back at the lit windows, at silhouettes continuing an evening that had, for one unbearable minute, made her its entertainment, and felt something unfamiliar taking up space where the old cold ache usually lived. She didn't trust it yet, but she noticed it. The tailoring shop on Ferris Lane opened at 8, and Nora was there by 7:15 most mornings, steaming out wrinkles and threading needles before the first client arrived. A rhythm that had survived worse mornings than the one after Vivian's wedding, though barely. She was mid-alteration on a client's suit jacket, chalk marks tracing a new shoulder line, when the bell above the door announced someone she hadn't expected to see twice inside a week. "You found the shop." She didn't look up immediately, buying herself a moment to steady her expression. "I didn't give you the address this time either. Your website has one. I looked it up the same night." Marcus stood just inside the doorway, taking in the workspace with the same careful attention he'd given the ballroom. The bolts of fabric stacked by weight, the client fitting room curtained off in the back, the mannequin dressed in a half-finished tuxedo jacket near the window. "I have a proposal, and I didn't trust myself to explain it properly by phone." "A proposal?" Nora set down her chalk, wary now in a different register than she'd been on the terrace. "For alterations or something else?" "For a partnership eventually if you're willing to consider it. But today more immediately for a favor." He produced a folder from his coat, sliding it across her work table. Sketches for a menswear line he was quietly backing, garment specs dense with fabric choices that read, to Nora's trained eye, as expensive and slightly wrong. "My design consultant proposed this collection, and something about it doesn't sit right with me. I don't have the vocabulary to explain why." Nora wiped her hands and studied the sketches properly, professional instinct overtaking her earlier caution the way it always did when actual craft was in front of her. "It's wrong because the tailoring is fighting the fabric. Structured shoulders on a drape this soft. The jacket will never sit right on a real body, only on the mannequin it was designed for. Whoever drew this wanted to prove they could combine trends. They didn't design for how it moves when an actual person wears it into a room. What would you do instead? Ease the shoulder, let the fabric do the work it wants to do. Good tailoring doesn't fight the material. It listens to it." She slid the folder back toward him, drawing a boundary carefully even as the work itself pulled at something satisfying in her chest. "You could have emailed these questions. I could have." He didn't offer an easier explanation, and the plainness of leaving it there sat better with her than a smoother excuse would have. "I'll have my office send the full brief if you'd consider consulting properly. Paid work, nothing to do with the wedding. I'll think about it." She meant it honestly, not as a polite deflection, and something in his expression suggested he'd correctly read the difference between the two. He left without pressing further, And Nora spent the rest of the morning turning the conversation over, hunting for the angle she still expected to find. It unsettled her more not finding one than locating it would have. Priya called that evening, her voice carrying the particular energy of someone with gossip too good to sit on. I've been asking around about your ballroom rescuer. Marcus Vance doesn't invest in anything without an exit strategy, and he definitely doesn't spend 3 days quietly checking on someone he humiliated a bride to help. What's actually happening there? Nothing's happening. He needed a professional opinion on a fabric consultation. Nora heard how thin that sounded even as she said it. Priya's skepticism carried through the phone, warm and unbothered. I photographed a gala he held 2 years ago. The rumor mill calls him Old Money Menace, but I watched him personally carry an elderly caterer's supply boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the venue's elevator broke. No cameras anywhere near it. People's reputations and their actual character rarely match. Just be careful which one you're trusting. The caution landed somewhere useful, and Nora carried it with her 3 days later, when she passed the loading dock behind Ashgrove Textiles, the mill supplying fabric for Marcus's new line, and caught him crouched beside a delivery driver's truck, not with a checkbook flourished for cameras, but quietly counting cash into an envelope while the driver gestured, exhausted, about a payment that had bounced from an unrelated contractor entirely. That's not my invoice to cover, she heard him say, patient, unhurried, with no audience anywhere near the exchange. But you did the delivery and whoever hired you skipped town instead of paying. I'm not going to let that cost you your fuel money for the week because someone else lied. He was already folding the envelope closed. Call it a loan if it helps you sleep tonight. I don't need it back. Nora stepped back before he noticed her watching, something in her chest recalibrating around information she hadn't asked for. The financial pages painted Marcus Vance in the language of old-world menace. A man rumored to keep enforcers instead of lawyers. A man whose family fortune had murky roots nobody in polite company asked about directly. What she just watched matched none of that reputation and matched exactly what Priya had described. Her phone buzzed as she walked back toward her car. An unfamiliar number, a message dropped without context. Ask your new friend what he actually wants from someone like you. Men like that collect projects. Don't confuse being noticed with being valued. She didn't need the area code to guess exactly whose bitterness had typed it. She stood beside her car a long moment, the message glowing in her palm, and felt the first real spark of anger arrive in place of the old familiar shrinking. Not at Marcus, not even fully at Vivian yet, but at the sheer exhausting persistence of being made to doubt the one thing in weeks that had felt uncomplicated. The first cancellation arrived disguised as politeness. A longtime client's assistant calling to reschedule a fitting indefinitely, citing a change in direction that hadn't come up in 3 prior consultations. The second cancellation wasn't nearly as careful. A boutique that had been placing wholesale orders with Nora's shop for 2 years called to end the relationship outright, and the manager, flustered and apologetic, let something slip before hanging up. There's a story going around that you seduced Marcus Vance to sabotage his business partnership with your sister's husband. My owner doesn't want that kind of controversy attached to our brand. Nora sat with the phone in her hand afterward, feeling the specific vertigo of watching a lie outpace the truth's ability to correct it. She'd built this shop from a single sewing machine in a rented backroom into a business with a real storefront and a client list she'd earned one careful stitch at a time. Vivian had unmade a meaningful fraction of it inside a single week, with nothing but a story whispered into the right ears. The third blow arrived through Priya, who showed up at the shop unannounced with her laptop already open, jaw tight. You need to see this before someone sends it to you cold. She turned the screen, a private group chat screenshot, forwarded and re-forwarded until its origin had blurred, showing Vivian's own words in stark type. She's always been desperate for attention. Wouldn't put it past her to have planned the whole thing to land a rich man. Feel bad for Marcus honestly getting played like that. It's circulating in at least 4 different social circles now. I recognized 2 of the names in the thread from the wedding photography list. Nora read it twice, feeling something colder than hurt settle into the reading. Not surprise exactly, just confirmation of a pattern she'd spent 11 years hoping was smaller than it actually was. She's not just letting a rumor stand. She's actively writing it. She's protecting herself. Priya closed the laptop gently. This isn't really about you or Marcus. It's about her needing a version of that night where she's the wronged party instead of the one who made you kneel in front of 300 people. Nora called Marcus before deciding whether calling him made her precisely the kind of dependent she'd sworn not to become. I've lost 3 accounts this week. No preamble the moment he answered. There's a rumor that I seduced you to sabotage the shipping deal for money, and I have proof now that it's not just a rumor spreading on its own. Vivian is writing it herself in private group chats, and it's circulating faster than I can track. Send me what you have. His voice sharpened instantly, calm replaced by something harder. I've had 2 separate calls this week repeating variations of the same story, both citing a friend who was there as the source. This confirms where it's actually coming from. Then I have a decision to make. Nora's hand tightened around the phone, old instinct visibly warring against something newer inside her. Let it stand and hope it burns out before it costs me the whole shop. Or fight it publicly, the way I've never once fought anything about my own name. What do you want to do? The question, offered without an answer already attached, was the thing that decided her. I want the truth said plainly in front of the same people who watched me kneel on that floor. Not whispered corrections. I want it said where it can't be walked back quietly. Then we build it properly. Resolve stacked on top of the anger in his voice. I have the loading dock security footage, timestamps proving the cash exchange had nothing to do with you. I have texts from the driver confirming the unrelated debt. And I'll put my own name on a public statement clarifying the timeline instead of hiding behind counsel. That costs you something too. Nora had learned, over the last 2 weeks, to notice when help arrived without a price tag and to question it anyway, because the questioning mattered as much as the answer. Your investors, your reputation. Attaching your name publicly to a scandal instead of staying above it entirely. I've spent 15 years staying quiet about things that don't matter and being direct about the ones that do. His voice held steady entirely without performance. This matters. I'd rather spend the reputation than watch her use my silence as a weapon against you. Nora closed her eyes, feeling the old instinct for smallness argue one final time, and found for the first time in longer than she could measure, that the instinct lost the argument cleanly. Then let's build it. All of it. Nothing held back for later. The retraction calls trickled in over the following days after Marcus's statement went public, clients returning with careful apologies that never quite admitted fault outright. And Nora took each one without the satisfaction she'd expected, because Vivian wasn't finished yet. Celeste arrived at the shop on a Thursday afternoon, standing in the doorway with an expression that wasn't quite anger, closer to panic, wearing anger's borrowed clothes. You need to have Marcus withdraw that statement. Vivian is devastated. Her husband's shipping deal is in jeopardy over this, and the whole family is. I'm the one who told the truth after I was humiliated in front of 300 people and then blamed for the fallout. Nora set down her shears, steadier than she expected, delivering that sentence to her own stepmother. I didn't create this scandal. Vivian created it the moment she made me kneel for a room full of witnesses. I only stopped absorbing the cost of it quietly. You've always made everything so difficult. Celeste's voice cracked at its edges, the old script arriving on reflex. The one that had worked on Nora for over a decade. This is tearing the family apart, and you're the one who... I let moments go for 11 years, Celeste. Something in Nora's own voice surprised her. Not cruelty, just clarity, unhurried and without apology. The seating charts. The cropped photographs. Being introduced as sister of the bride, with no first name attached, at my own sister's wedding. I let all of it go because letting it go was easier than being called difficult. I'm not doing that anymore. Celeste left without an answer, and Nora stood alone in the quiet shop afterward, expecting the old guilt to arrive the way it always had after standing her ground with family. It didn't come. Something had shifted permanently, and she recognized, with something close to grief for the version of herself who used to fold automatically, that there was no route back to folding now. The financial pressure escalated in parallel. Marcus's office called 2 days later, his assistant relaying with careful neutrality that 2 of his own longtime investors had requested a meeting over reputational concerns tied to the public statement. When Nora arrived at his office that evening at his request, she found him at his desk with the particular stillness of a man absorbing consequences he'd chosen willingly and was still recalculating the weight of. They want me to walk it back, he said without preamble, sliding a printed memo across the desk. Frame it as a private family matter, distance myself publicly, let the story die on its own terms instead of mine. Are you considering it? No. The answer arrived immediately and unshaken. But I wanted you to know the cost is real, not theoretical. I'd rather you hear it from me than assume I'm handling this without any friction at all. The final escalation arrived from Vivian directly, 3 days later, timed for the lunch rush when other customers would witness whatever she'd come to say. You've ruined everything. Vivian's voice carried the practiced brightness gone entirely brittle, aimed at the browsing customers instead of Nora directly. Marcus's family is humiliated. My husband's business is collapsing. Because you couldn't take a joke and had to run crying to a man with money to fight your battles for you. I didn't run to him. Nora didn't lower her voice to match the private register Vivian clearly wanted. You made me kneel on a marble floor in front of 300 people. He witnessed it and decided your family's cruelty wasn't something he wanted his name attached to. That's a consequence of your choice. You've always been jealous of me. Vivian's composure finally cracked fully, the accusation arriving raw for the first time since the wedding. The perfect daughter, the perfect life, and you couldn't stand it, so you found a rich man to blow it all up. I wasn't jealous of your life, Vivian. I was tired of being the punchline in it. Nora felt something settle in her chest, cold and clear, entirely inverted from the stillness on that ballroom floor. You spent our whole lives needing someone smaller than you to feel bigger. I'm done paying that price. Vivian left without a response, the shop's bell ringing hollow behind her, and Nora stood in the sudden silence of customers pretending not to have overheard, feeling something quieter and sturdier than triumph. The specific relief of finally saying, out loud in her own voice, what she'd swallowed for over a decade. But the confrontation left something unresolved sitting heavy in her chest, a certainty that Vivian wasn't finished, that the retreat had only bought time before one final, more public reckoning. Marcus found her an hour after closing, sitting on the shop's back step with tea gone cold in her hands. Celeste called me. He sat beside her, close but not crowding. She wanted to know if I'd consider a quiet settlement, some arrangement that made this go away before it cost Vivian's marriage further damage. What did you tell her? That there's nothing to settle. No claim, nothing to buy back. Just a truth that's already out, sitting exactly where it should have been all along. He studied the tired set of her shoulders. I also told her that if she wants her family repaired, the repair runs through an apology to you, not through my silence. Nora turned to look at him properly. Why does this matter to you? Not the leverage answer. The real one. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might deflect. Instead, something in his face went unguarded. My mother tailored uniforms for dockworkers most of her life before she opened her own shop, and I watched wealthy men treat her skill as a service instead of a craft for 20 years, right up until she was sewing suits for the same men who used to underestimate her. His voice carried old, private weight. I recognized something in the way that the ballroom laughed at you. I recognized the specific cruelty of deciding someone's worth doesn't matter because their circumstances don't match the room's expectations. So I remind you of her. At first. Then I spent 2 weeks watching you decide in real time to stop making yourself smaller for people who'd never earned that sacrifice. That's not about my mother anymore. That's entirely about you. He held her gaze, steady, the same stillness she'd first read as calculation and had slowly learned to read as attention. Priya's call came through as Nora was walking Marcus to his car, her voice tight with urgency. The Maritime Trade Alliance dinner. Vivian just confirmed her attendance publicly, posted it an hour ago. Same social circle from the wedding. I know that look you get when you're bracing for something, and I think you should brace for this one specifically. Nora relayed it to Marcus, feeling the shape of the coming confrontation settle into place. She won't leave it here. She'll try once more somewhere public to rewrite this in her favor, in front of the same people who watched the original moment. I know her well enough to know that too. Nora said it plainly without dread. When she does, it's mine to close. Not you speaking for me. Agreed. Something almost like relief moved across his face. I'll be in the room. This last one is yours. The Maritime Trade Alliance dinner filled the Ashgrove Ballroom's smaller hall 3 weeks later. The same social circle that had watched Nora kneel now gathered for an entirely different evening. One where Vivian, dressed in careful understatement, worked the room rebuilding her image one conversation at a time. Nora arrived at Marcus's invitation not as his guest exactly, but as the tailor whose custom pieces for his menswear line were being unveiled that night for the first time. Structured jackets that moved the way fabric wanted to move, drawing quiet compliments from guests who had no idea they were praising the same hands that had knelt on the Ashgrove ballroom floor a month earlier. Priya moved through the crowd with her camera, close enough to catch whatever came next, far enough to let it happen without interference. Vivian found her near the bar, timing her approach for an audience. A small cluster of shipping executives drifting close enough to overhear. Nora. I'm glad you came. The old brightness rehearsed and brittle at its edges. I've been hoping we'd clear the air properly in front of people who matter to both of us. She turned toward the gathered executives, cultivating witnesses the way she had at her own wedding. There's been such a misunderstanding about what happened. Emotions were high, everyone had too much champagne, and I think Nora took an old family game more seriously than it was meant. The old instinct rose in Nora's chest, the pull toward smoothing it over, letting Vivian's version stand. She let the instinct arrive and deliberately set it down. There's no misunderstanding. Nora's voice stayed level, pitched exactly loud enough for the gathered witnesses to hear every word without her raising it. You made me kneel and kiss your shoe in front of 300 people, the same way you used to demand small humiliations as children to earn the privilege of being included. That's not a family game. That's a pattern, and it stopped being funny to anyone but you a long time ago. That's not fair. Vivian's composure flickered. You're painting me as some villain over one moment at my own wedding. I'm describing what happened plainly to people curious enough to ask. Nora held her sister's gaze without flinching. When I lost 3 accounts to a rumor you started about seducing Marcus for money, a rumor you wrote yourself in private group chats that didn't stay private, I didn't fight publicly out of spite. I did it because I'd spent 11 years letting you write the story of who I am, and I finally understood what that silence cost me every single time. A ripple moved through the small crowd at the mention of the group chat, several faces recalculating in real time, and Nora watched the realization land on Vivian that the screenshots had reached further than she'd accounted for. You always do this. Vivian's voice climbed anyway, brittle now, the executives around them going still, interested despite themselves. Make everything about how hard your life's been, like the rest of us didn't struggle. I'm not asking you to validate my struggle. I stopped needing that from you a while ago. Nora kept her voice even, which landed harder than anger would have. I'm telling you in front of the people you hoped would take your side, that the story you tried to tell isn't the one that happened. You can keep telling your version. It won't be the only one in this room anymore, and it won't be the one that sticks. The executives exchanged glances that carried their own quiet verdict. Vivian's mouth opened on some final argument that visibly failed to arrive, and for the first time since childhood, Nora watched her sister's composure fail completely in public, with no cropped photograph to soften it afterward. This isn't over, Vivian said finally, quieter now, the fight gone from the volume even if not entirely from the words. It is actually. Nora said it without malice, only certainty. Not because I won something. Because I'm done fighting for a version of myself small enough to fit into the space you've always wanted me to take up. Vivian turned and walked back into the crowd, and the executives drifted into their own conversations, the moment already reshaping into whatever story this circle would tell about tonight. One where Nora Callahan had spoken for herself plainly, and hadn't needed anyone standing beside her to make it land. Priya lowered her camera, catching Nora's eye across the room with a small, proud nod that said everything the moment didn't need words for. 6 months later, the shop on Ferris Lane occupied a storefront twice its old size, the window displaying tailored pieces that had, somewhere in the last half-year, become recognizable enough on the city's fashion circuit that clients requested Nora by name instead of finding her through referrals that used to require someone else's endorsement first. She stood behind the work table on a Tuesday morning, finalizing patterns for a spring collection, her third project with Marcus's menswear line, a fact that still felt improbable whenever she thought about it, when the bell above the door announced a familiar arrival. You're early. She didn't look up immediately, though the smile arrived before she could stop it. The design review isn't until 11. It isn't. Marcus crossed to the work table, the same unhurried walk she'd first noticed across a silent ballroom, except the silence between them now carried an entirely different weight. I wanted to see the spring patterns before the board did. I have a vested interest in whether the tailoring embarrasses the investment. It won't. Nora turned the sketches toward him, watching him study her work with the same attention he'd given it from the very beginning. Not performance, not pity, genuine interest in something she'd built with her own hands. Softer shoulders again, but sharper through the waist this time. I've been thinking about movement more than structure lately. You've been thinking about a lot of things differently lately, he said gently, an observation rather than a question. Celeste had called twice in the last month, careful, tentative calls that stopped just short of apology but edged closer than anything in 11 years before. Vivian hadn't called at all, and Nora had made a fragile peace with that silence, understanding that some repairs took longer than 6 months if they came at all, and that she no longer needed them to arrive on any timeline to feel whole in the meantime. Priya had become a fixture of ordinary Tuesdays now too, dropping by with coffee and gossip that had softened over months into something closer to genuine friendship than curiosity about a rich man's rescue. I keep thinking about that place card, Nora said, setting the sketches down. Sister of the bride, no first name. I spent so long believing that was accurate, that I really was just an appendage to someone else's more important story. She felt the old ache arrive, softer now, more memory than wound. I don't believe that anymore. For what it's worth, Marcus said, I never once saw an appendage. I saw someone whose skill outpaced the credit she was given for it, in a room too invested in the wrong things to notice. He reached across the table, not for her hand exactly, just close enough that the space between them carried its own quiet invitation. I'd like to keep noticing if you're willing to let that continue past the spring collection. Nora looked at him, steady, unhurried, offering exactly what he said and nothing more complicated underneath it, and felt none of the old instinct to brace for a hidden price. I think I'd like that. He said it plainly without performance, slowly, built on something sturdier than one dramatic night at a wedding. Slowly, he agreed, and the word carried something like relief in it, a man equally unused to being trusted without an agenda attached. That afternoon, Nora walked into the design review unhurried, her portfolio under one arm, and felt the room's attention shift toward her the way rooms did now. Not the old cold weight of being watched for a punchline, but something closer to expectation, the particular respect reserved for someone whose reputation no longer required anyone else's introduction to carry weight. She thought, crossing that room, of the marble floor 6 months earlier, cold beneath her knees, the specific stillness that had settled into her chest in that unbearable moment, and understood finally that the stillness had never been an ending. It had been the first quiet second before everything in her thawed and rose and decided once and for all to stop disappearing. If you'd been kneeling on that floor, would you have found your voice as quickly as Nora did, or would it have taken you longer to stop believing the room's laughter was the truth about you? Thank you for reading. There are more stories like this one waiting whenever you're ready for them.